Can you believe that everything you know about safety, comfort, and the simple promise of tomorrow is a lie? Forget running water. Forget antibiotics. Forget the rule of law that protects the common man. You are about to step backward, not just a few years, but into a 400-year-long nightmare known simply as medieval England, where the only guarantee was that life was cheap, brutal, and perpetually on the edge of utter collapse.
This wasn't a time of romanticized knights and glittering castles. This was a desperate war against existence itself. Imagine waking up, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the desperate gnawing in your stomach, knowing that one wrong move, one cough, one bad harvest could wipe out your entire family, and a catastrophe no one saw coming was lurking just around the corner, ready to strike the village like a sudden, merciless hammer blow. We are dropping anchor in the heart of the Dark Ages, sometime between the Norman conquest's echoes and the terrifying shadow of the Wars of the Roses. This is the world of the serf, the peasant bound to the land like a chattel, whose primary function was not living, but merely surviving long enough to pay the crushing tithes to the Lord who owned the dirt beneath his feet and the very soul in his weary body.
The sun hasn't even fully risen over the wretched cluster of wattle and daub huts you call home, yet the air is already thick with the metallic stench of unwashed bodies, stale straw, and the ever-present, terrifying evidence of human waste that pools just outside your single cramped room. Your floor? Packed earth, shared often with the livestock, providing minimal warmth and serving as the perfect breeding ground for every fever, pox, and pestilence known to man and beast.
Your name is Thomas, perhaps, and you are 25 years old, ancient by these standards, having somehow survived childhood. And you know that today, like every day, is a desperate gamble. You must drag your aching body out to the fields to toil for the lord of the manor, Baron Reginald the Cruel, before you can even think about scratching out enough meager food from your own tiny strip of land to feed your wife, Agnes, and your 3 surviving children, 2 of whom already look dangerously frail. Thomas's arms are perpetually stiff from the unrelenting labor required to turn the heavy, unforgiving earth with the simple wooden mold-bore plow, a task that demands the strength of 3 men and leaves him perpetually exhausted by sundown. This is the week work, the 2 or 3 days out of every week where every ounce of your effort belongs entirely to the Baron, maintaining his domain lands, repairing his fences, and ensuring that his granaries are stuffed full, even while your own children's ribs are showing beneath their threadbare tunics. Fail this duty, even once, and the bailiff, a man whose face is as hard and unforgiving as the stone keep, will be upon you instantly, demanding not just your labor, but a crippling fine in coin or goods, a debt that could instantly plunge your family into starvation, a debt they would never recover from until death finally offered release. The medieval clock doesn't tick in minutes or hours. It ticks solely
in threats. There is the visible threat, the bailiff's whip, ready to lash out for slow work or perceived insubordination, a punishment that leaves scars deep enough to weep blood and immediately threatens fatal infection, because any open wound in this era is potentially a death sentence you carry back into your hovel.
Then there is the invisible threat, the water you drink, drawn from a stream downstream of the very spot where the entire village discards their refuse. A lethal cocktail that guarantees a persistent, grinding illness that saps your energy and makes the back-breaking farm work unbearable. Can you believe that the average lifespan here barely scraped past 35, and half the children born never made it past the age of 5?
This isn't just history recounted in dry texts. It's a living horror story written in sweat, blood, and the perpetual, suffocating fear of the unknown. Life was a terrible lottery where the grand prize was simply making it to the next morning without succumbing to dysentery, a simple cold, or the Lord's capricious temper that could condemn you to the stocks for stealing a single apple. Your village, nestled beneath the imposing, cold stone walls of Baron Reginald's castle, existed solely as an economic engine for his vanity and power. Every grain you harvested, every egg your meager hen laid, every single moment of your waking life belonged fundamentally to the feudal system, a machine designed to extract maximum value while offering minimum humanity. A system upheld by the threat of violence and eternal damnation. The Baron, meanwhile, slept beneath thick woolen blankets imported from Flanders, dined daily on roasted venison spiced with exotic pepper from the distant Orient, and enjoyed the unheard-of privilege of clean, well-drawn water, while your family huddled together on a bed of infested straw, praying that the rats wouldn't steal the last crust of hard black bread reserved for supper. The divide wasn't just class. It was the absolute, stark chasm between survival versus certain death, often separated only by the thickness of a castle wall. But the absolute worst terror of all, it wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the cold biting through your threadbare clothing. It was the terrifying, immediate consequence of a failed harvest. If the vital spring rains didn't come when they were needed, or if they came too hard and too fast, drowning the crops in mud, the entire delicate balance shattered, transforming scarcity into deadly famine overnight. And when the famine hit, when the belly of the land turned against its people, the Baron didn't starve. You did. He merely raised his rents, tightened the screws, and watched from his turret as the weakest of his tenants, the very workers who sustained him, began to wither away along the muddy roads. In the coming chapters of this saga, we are going deep into the brutal realities that shaped these 4 centuries of human struggle. We will witness trial by ordeal, where justice was decided by grabbing a searing hot poker or drowning in icy water. We will brave the terrifying streets of London, where sanitation was non-existent and crime was rampant, leading to public executions that were considered the highest form of family entertainment. We will uncover the forbidden truths about medieval marriage, the gruesome details of the barber surgeon's rusty toolkit, and why the local priest held more terrifying, soul-crushing power than any king. Get ready, because the veneer of historical romance is about to be violently stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly, magnificent terror that was daily life in medieval England. Brace yourself. You are stepping directly into the darkness. You think you know hunger. Forget your fad diets and your occasional missed meal. The hunger of the medieval era was a living, breathing entity, a predator that stalked every single soul from the moment they drew their first smoke-filled breath. It was not just an emptiness. It was the constant low-grade buzz of fear that vibrated through your bones, reminding you that your life and the lives of your children hinged entirely on the mood of the sky and the whims of the local overlord. Survival was not a right. It was a privilege bought daily with sweat and submission. The glamorous tapestry of historical romance is utterly shredded when you realize the true tyranny governing 90% of the population. The tyranny of the soil itself. Your entire world was contained within the 3 great fields surrounding the village, carved up into impossibly long, thin strips, the infamous open field system. You didn't farm a nice, neat, square plot. You farmed scattered ribbons of land, making efficiency a cruel joke, and cooperation mandatory, which meant if one failed, everyone starved. This was the terrifying gamble. Plant in the spring, pray through the summer, and hope against all hope that the harvest was successful enough to last until the next cycle, while simultaneously paying the Lord his due. The odds were stacked against you with a mathematical certainty only Mother Nature could devise. The average English peasant lived on a knife edge, a caloric tightrope walker balancing over the abyss. You had to produce enough to feed your family, enough to save seed for the next year, and enough, crucially, to satisfy the demands of the Lord and the Church. 3 bad harvests in a row. That wasn't just recession. That was immediate, widespread annihilation. The memory of the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, when torrential rains turned the fields into swamps, and people were forced to eat their seed grain just to survive the winter, still haunted the collective consciousness like a vengeful ghost. Whole villages simply vanished. Cannibalism, once an unspeakable horror, became whispered history, a constant, horrifying possibility, waiting just beyond the next crop failure. And even when the crops did come in, the first, the most substantial, and the most delicious portion was never yours. It belonged, irrevocably, to the man in the castle. The lord of the manor. He didn't just own the land. He owned your time,
your production, and your very existence, cemented by the iron fist of the feudal contract. You were a serf, not a slave in the Roman sense, but essentially fixed to the land like a grotesque human plant, unable to leave without the Lord's costly and often denied permission. You might think of rent as a monthly coin payment. They thought of rent as labor, the dreaded corvée. 3 days a week, sometimes more, you were forced to work the Lord's domain, his private lands, before you were ever allowed to touch your own meager strips.
Imagine standing over your own dying crops, watching the precious moisture evaporate, knowing that if you don't water them immediately, your family starves. But the bailiff's whip demands you mend the Lord's fence first. That was the daily, soul-crushing torment of the serf.
Your priority was always the maintenance of the wealth that oppressed you. And the taxes, the taxes were not just financial instruments. They were tools of psychological warfare, designed to remind you constantly that you were disposable property. There was the tallage, an arbitrary tax the Lord could levy whenever he pleased, to fund a new wing on his castle, or perhaps just a particularly decadent feast. You had zero recourse. You paid or you starved, and often you paid and you still starved. Then came the Harriet, the sickening death tax, a truly malicious levy. Upon the death of the head of the household, the Lord had the right to seize the best beast, often the only cow or plow horse the family owned. A family's grief was immediately compounded by financial ruin. Ensuring the next generation started even deeper in the pit of poverty. You couldn't leave. Try to flee the manor, and the Lord's men would hunt you down, drag you back, and punish you publicly, transforming your desperate act into a chilling, bloody lesson in absolute submission for the rest of the downtrodden community. Now, let's talk about the feast, or the utter lack thereof. Your diet was a masterclass in relentless beige monotony. Forget the roasted boar and mead of the romantic tales. Your sustenance was the pottage. A thick, slow-cooked stew, made primarily of whatever cheap grains, barley, oats, or perhaps the tougher rye, could be salvaged, mixed with peas, beans, and maybe, on a truly glorious day, a few foraged greens. It was often thin, acidic, and nutritionally suspect, but it was filling, and filling was all that mattered. Meat. Meat was a fantasy, reserved almost exclusively for the Lord's table, or perhaps the scraps of a successful and often illegal poaching trip, a risk that could cost you your hand or your life if caught. You consumed gallons of weak ale every day, not for recreation, but because the water was often so polluted it was a death sentence waiting to happen. The beer had been boiled, making it the safer, if slightly intoxicating, choice for everyone, including the children. The place you called home was no refuge. It was a breeding ground for misery and disease. Step inside that wattle and daub hut, a structure built of woven sticks, plastered with mud and animal dung, covered by a leaky thatched roof, and immediately feel the crush of the darkness. There were no windows, only gaps shuttered against the biting cold, meaning the interior was perpetually dim, even at noon. And the smoke. Oh, the smoke was everywhere, a constant, abrasive presence. The open hearth fire, essential for warmth and cooking, had no chimney. The smoke simply drifted, searching for the nearest exit, filling the low, cramped space, coating your lungs, your clothes, and the few possessions you owned in a thick, choking layer of soot. You slept on straw mattresses, often shared with the livestock brought in for warmth. Pigs, chickens, maybe a cow. Privacy was a non-concept. The floor was often just packed dirt, slippery with mud and refuse. This was life compressed into a single, terrifying room, shared by 8 or 10 people, livestock, vermin, and the constant, chilling knowledge that tomorrow was just another day of back-breaking labor, designed to sustain the obscene wealth of the man who despised you. They didn't just survive the elements. They survived the intentional cruelty of a system that valued an ox more than a human life. And that is the true, horrifying darkness we have just begun to explore. Now let the bells toll for the next great threat, the medieval plague that didn't come from the rats, but from the terrifying filth under your own feet. The air itself was a weapon aimed directly at your lungs. Forget the glamorous tales of knights in shining armor. The true enemy of medieval England was the invisible army marching out of your cesspit. Every single breath you took was a gamble against a miasma thick with decaying matter and human waste, a perfume of death that hung perpetually over every village, every burgeoning town. The ground you walked on was not soil. It was a layered history of refuse. Think of your average village lane. It was simultaneously a public toilet, a garbage dump, and the primary thoroughfare for livestock, all mashed together into a viscous, biohazardous mud. This was the terrifying reality of daily life. You were literally wading through the potential source of your own agonizing demise. Where did the life-giving water come from? Usually the same shallow stream that received the runoff from the nearby latrine trench, which was often just a shallow ditch dug at the edge of the crop fields, occasionally covered with a thin layer of straw. No medieval person understood germ theory. They believed the sickness came from bad air, the miasma. But the truth was far more terrifyingly simple. They were drinking concentrated poison every single day of their short lives. The inevitable result? The great silent killer that stalked the peasantry year after year, claiming more lives than any skirmish or famine, the red flux, or bloody dysentery. This was not a quick fever. This was a total internal war,
an explosion of agonizing dehydration and stomach cramps that could reduce a strong man to a shivering, desiccated wreck within days. Imagine the utter terror as the sickness ripped through your family. One day, your child is working the field, helping gather the meager harvest. The next, they are locked in a horrifying cycle of uncontrollable evacuation, their body fluids draining away until their skin turns gray and cold, and their eyes sink into their skull. There was no cure. Only desperate prayers whispered into the suffocating darkness of a dirt-floored hovel, and the stark knowledge that death was arriving by the hour.
And what of personal cleanliness? Forget the grand Roman bathhouses. Bathing in medieval England was rare, often viewed with suspicion, or simply impossible given the grinding demands of labor and the scarcity of clean, warm water. When the water source itself was contaminated, why risk putting more of that lethal fluid on your skin?
The human body became a moving, temporary ecosystem for parasites. Every man, woman, and child carried a teeming, secret population of lice, fleas, and mites. These weren't just itchy inconveniences that kept you awake at night. They were tiny, hopping plague vectors, invisible couriers carrying typhus and trench fever from one unfortunate soul to the next, ready to deposit lethal bacteria right into your bloodstream with a single quick bite.
The clothing, thick, coarse wool and linen, was rarely washed, sometimes worn continuously for months, even years, harboring these creatures and trapping the sweat and grime of years of toil until the garments were stiff with dirt. When you slept, you were sharing your straw mattress, often placed directly on the earth floor, with rats, mice, and countless unseen insects, amplifying the risk of catastrophic infection exponentially. The bed was not a place of rest. It was a biological battleground.
The very design of the feudal village magnified this danger, turning every cluster of homes into a crucible of contagion. Houses were clustered tightly together, thatched roofs offering perfect nesting sites for vermin, and the smoke from the central hearth did little to cleanse the air, only adding choking particulates to the already lethal atmosphere.
And the livestock, the pigs, the chickens, the oxen, were not kept far away. They often shared the same single room with the family during the brutal winter months when warmth was paramount. This meant that animal excrement, animal diseases like anthrax and swine fever, and human beings were all breathing the same stagnant, infectious air, separated only by a wisp of straw or a low partition. The proximity was staggering, a kind of forced biological intimacy that guaranteed rapid contagion whenever a new disease entered the community from a traveling merchant or a returning soldier. If one person coughed, the whole hamlet braced for the inevitable sweep of sickness. It wasn't a matter of if you would get sick. It was an absolute certainty of when and how many of your children would survive the agonizing ordeal. Every sneeze was an alarm bell, every fever a death sentence awaiting confirmation by the morning light. And when the sickness struck, who did the terrified serfs turn to? The village wise woman, perhaps, skilled in ineffective folklore, or the itinerant barber surgeon, a man whose medical knowledge was built on superstition, the stars, and absolutely lethal practices inherited from ancient texts. Their remedies often involved ineffective herbal poultices, chanting to ward off evil spirits, or, worst of all, the medieval medical standard, the practice of bleeding. Bleeding, or phlebotomy, was based on the belief in the four humors. If you were sick, it was believed you had an excess of blood, and the catastrophic solution was often to slice a vein or use leeches to drain a significant amount of the patient's already depleted blood, often performed regardless of the illness. Picture the terrifying irony. A person dying of dysentery, already severely dehydrated and weakened by starvation and internal hemorrhaging, being deliberately bled by a man using an unsterilized, often rusty lancet. This cure was frequently the final, fatal injury, ensuring that even if the disease didn't kill you immediately, the medieval medical professional certainly would finish the job with speed and precision. This crushing cycle of filth, disease, and lethal cures was the daily reality that chipped away at the population, ensuring high mortality. The average life expectancy hovered terrifyingly low, dragged down by the sheer volume of infant and child mortality, where perhaps half of all children never reached their 10th birthday. To reach adulthood was a statistical miracle. To reach old age, an act of cosmic defiance against the very laws of nature and biology. The fragility of their existence was absolute, dictated not by grand battles or royal decrees, but by the microscopic terrors swimming in their well and clinging fiercely to their skin. But even as the peasant fought this endless, invisible war against disease and death, the visible, all too present threat of the feudal lord never slept, demanding sacrifice, obedience, and the ultimate price. That terrifying figure of unchecked power waits, poised to strike the moment the peasant falters, ready to demand the very last measure of their strength and loyalty, ensuring that the chains of serfdom were heavier than any plague. The chains were not just made of iron and fear. They were forged in the inescapable ledger of debt and obligation that ruled every single sunrise. Even if the harvest was successful, even if the plague skipped your village for a year, the most terrifying specter looming over the wattle and daub hut was not the devil, but the bailiff, the man who came to collect the price of simply existing on the Lord's land. The concept of freedom was an alien, impossible dream that dissolved into the muddy reality of the fields. You were born into obligation, destined to work the domain, the Lord's private lands, before you ever touched your own meager strips in the common field. Imagine dedicating 2 or 3 days a week, sometimes more during the critical planting and harvesting seasons, to enriching the very man who held your life hostage, knowing that a single missed day meant swift, brutal reprisal. This wasn't just physical labor. It was psychological warfare waged daily against the spirit. Every bead of sweat was counted, every furrow measured by the cold, calculating eye of the reeve, who was himself just a slightly elevated serf, desperate to prove his loyalty and avoid the same crushing punishments. You labored under the brutal Khan, your back screaming, hauling the rudimentary plows, spreading the muck, watching the Lord's crops grow taller and healthier than anything you could hope to feed your own starving children.
But labor, the crushing work of the domain, was only the beginning of the economic nightmare that awaited. When your own pathetic barley patch finally yielded its precious, life-giving bounty, the Lord reached out with a greedy, invisible hand to take a piece of that, too. This was the dreaded gafal, rent paid not in coin, which was rare and precious anyway, but in kind.
This meant surrendering a percentage of your harvested grain, presenting a specific number of fat hens at Christmas, delivering meticulously counted eggs at Easter, and perhaps even yielding a side of bacon if you were lucky enough to keep and feed a swine through the lean months. These were non-negotiable taxes, demanded with merciless, terrifying precision, ensuring that the serf lived perpetually on the knife edge of survival, always one bad storm or one bureaucratic oversight away from absolute, family-starving ruin. And the Lord didn't stop at your produce. He claimed ownership of your tools, your time, and your very means of survival, demanding fees for the most basic, necessary acts of daily life. Want to grind the grain that you worked so hard to grow and keep? You must use the Lord's mill, paying a hefty multure fee, a tax often paid by surrendering a substantial portion of the flour itself before you ever took it home. Want to bake your bread, the sustenance that kept your children from fading away? You must use the Lord's communal oven, another crushing fee that chipped away at your already minuscule reserves. It was an ingenious, profoundly evil system, designed with terrifying efficiency to siphon off every possible calorie and every rare coin from the peasantry, trapping them firmly in a cycle of dependency that spanned relentless, unforgiving generations.
And woe betide the young woman who dared to fall in love outside the invisible lines drawn by the manorial charter. Before she could marry a man from a different manor, or sometimes even one from the same village, her family had to pay the merchet, the dreaded marriage fine. This fee was literally the price of replacing the labor lost to the Lord, a stark, brutal reminder that even your offspring were considered mere chattel, economic units whose reproductive futures belonged ultimately and terrifyingly to the landowner. But the terror peaked not in the endless mud of the fields, but inside the dark, smoky, and fear-drenched confines of the manorial court. This was not a place of impartial justice where truth reigned supreme. It was the Lord's personal stage, where he embodied the terrifying trinity of judge, jury, and executioner, wielding absolute power over every peasant life. This court dealt with everything from the most petty disputes over field boundaries and livestock wandering into the wrong patch, to serious, life-altering accusations of theft, rebellion, or simply failing to fulfill one's labor duties to the Lord's satisfaction. The atmosphere inside the small hall was thick with suffocating dread, palpable enough to cut with a knife.
Imagine standing before the Lord, who sits elevated, robed in the finest wool and linen, while you are clad in rags and filth, knowing that your immediate fate, and the fate of your family, hangs entirely on His mood, His sobriety, and His interpretation of arbitrary custom. There were no lawyers, no appeals to a higher power, no recourse, only the immediate, terrifying judgment. Fines were common, often levied in precious livestock or essential grain, but corporal punishment was always on the table, a horrifying public spectacle designed to reinforce the absolute, unwavering hierarchy of power and fear. Failing to repair a communal fence, letting your pigs forage too freely in the woods, or even uttering a mild insult against the bailiff could result in a crippling financial penalty that might starve your family through the long, frozen winter. This ruthless system ensured total compliance, turning neighbors against each other as they were forced to report minor infractions to avoid severe punishment themselves. It bred a suffocating culture of suspicion, silence, and absolute crippling fear that permeated every conversation and every shadow after dusk. And the final, ultimate, cruelest twist in this relentless saga came upon death itself, the only true release the serf could ever hope for. When the patriarch finally succumbed to the disease, exhaustion, or malnutrition that defined his life, the Lord reached out one last time from beyond the grave to claim the Harriet, the death tax, the final insult. Picture the scene. The family is grieving, destitute, physically and emotionally weakened by the loss of their primary provider and strongest laborer. And yet, the bailiff arrives, not with condolences or comfort, but with cold legal authority to take the best cow they owned, or the only sturdy plow, leaving the survivors even more utterly vulnerable. This ensured that the cycle of crushing poverty and dependency continued without fail, casting a shadow over the mourning process itself. Even in the grave, the serf was not truly free from the grasp of the castle. This relentless, systemic extraction of wealth, loyalty, and dignity defined the entire medieval lifespan. The threat of starvation was constant. The pain of disease was unavoidable and terrifying. But the most suffocating oppression was the cold, hard knowledge that you were a tool, a resource, owned entirely by the distant, predatory power of the castle, a power that demanded everything, but guaranteed nothing except the right to keep laboring until you finally broke. You were not just a farmer. You were an asset locked into the very soil, defined by the invisible lines drawn on the parchment held safely within the castle keep. This was the feudal contract, a chain of obligation stretching from the king down to your mud-caked boots,
and every single link was designed to drain you dry.
The Lord himself, the Baron of the land, was often a glorious, terrifying ghost. He might visit once or twice a year, sweeping in with a retinue of armored men and demands for feasting. But his absence was often far more dangerous than his presence.
Because his absence meant the bailiff ruled. This man, usually a local appointed for his ruthlessness, or a distant official chosen for his lack of empathy, was the Baron's fist, the warden of your existence, holding the immediate power of punishment and the enforcement of the dreadful corvée. He stalked the narrow, fragmented strips of the open fields, measuring the exact depth of the furrows you plowed, noting every moment you dared to straighten your aching back, calculating precisely how much labor was owed back to the Demesne lands, the vast, profitable acreage reserved exclusively for the Lord's gain.
This was not a negotiation. It was an extraction, performed under constant surveillance. Every Tuesday and Wednesday, or perhaps 3 days a week during the crucial harvest, you left your own poultry plot to toil on the best land, knowing that the food you grew there would never pass your lips, only serve to fund the wars and the luxury of the distant aristocracy.
The resentment was a quiet, burning fire held deep in the belly, but to voice it was to invite swift, brutal annihilation. The feudal system was built on 2 pillars, terror and starvation, and both were expertly managed by the local enforcers. But the true terror, the mechanism that turned medieval justice into a horrific, unpredictable lottery, was the manor court. This was not a place of defense, nor a venue for appeal. It was the weekly or monthly ritual where the Lord's authority was made brutally, undeniably real, presided over by the cold, calculating steward. Imagine standing before this official, who spoke with the legalistic voice of absolute, unchecked ownership, recording every detail in the heavy, unforgiving court rolls. Everything was scrutinized. The petty squabbles over boundary markers, the failures to repair a stretch of fence, the accidental straying of a pig, and the most grievous crime of all, failing to produce the required output of labor or grain.
The fines were instantaneous and absolutely crushing, usually levied in the form of livestock, tools, or coin you barely possessed. You were essentially being penalized for the audacity of trying to survive, for failing to perfectly navigate a system designed to see you fail.
Did your daughter gather sticks in the forest that wasn't technically your wood? That was considered timber theft, punishable by a fine that could bankrupt your family for a year. Did your wife try to brew ale in your own miserable hut to save money, rather than paying the exorbitant toll to use the Lord's official brewery? That was an act of economic sabotage against the system of banality. These penalties weren't arbitrary acts of rage. They were meticulously documented in those heavy court rolls, ancient records that still chill historians today, detailing the systematic, almost scientific extraction of every resource from the most desperate,
vulnerable members of society. And the thought of leaving, escape, was not freedom. It was a desperate, usually suicidal gamble. To flee the village without explicit written permission was to become an outlaw, a runaway serf hunted by the Lord's men, stripped of the last vestiges of protection the feudal structure reluctantly provided. If you managed somehow to survive the terrifying, wolf-haunted wilderness, you faced immediate suspicion in any other established village. No neighboring lord wanted a vagrant serf bringing trouble, or worse, setting a dangerous example of successful rebellion through flight.
The vast, indifferent forests were less terrifying than the certainty of capture and the resulting penalty, which often involved public humiliation, severe corporal punishment, and a return to the very land you had tried to abandon.
Even the church, meant to be a source of solace and spiritual refuge, reinforced the brutal hierarchy. Local parish priests, themselves often poor, but bound to the structure, preached the divine order. God had placed the king above the nobles above the knights, and the serfs firmly at the bottom, performing the necessary labor for all. Your suffering, you were told from the pulpit, was a test. Your poverty, a potential spiritual virtue, and your absolute obedience to the baron was obedience to God's immutable plan for human existence. This spiritual reinforcement made rebellion not just dangerous to your life, but sacrilegious, a direct, mortal threat to your immortal soul itself. Look at the physical world of the village itself. It was a cluster of cramped, smoke-filled hovels built of rough timber, mud, and wattle and daub, the thatch roofs perpetually leaking and harboring endless swarms of vermin and disease-carrying rats. There was no sanitation beyond throwing waste into the street or into a shared, festering cesspit, located often dangerously close to the single communal well. This ensured that the next major epidemic, be it endemic dysentery, devastating smallpox, or the dreaded, swift sweating sickness, was always just around the corner, waiting for the perfect moment of weakness to strike down half the population. The whole system was a carefully calibrated engine of dependency and despair. From the mandated use of the Lord's oven, paying the required toll to bake your own bread, to the fixed number of days you spent working his land, every single breath, every tiny human necessity was taxed, controlled, and recorded. You were never truly free, not even in the darkness of your own tiny, miserable hut, sharing straw bedding with your entire family and perhaps a few essential animals. Your labor belonged entirely to the soil belonged entirely to the Lord, and the Lord's relentless, crushing demands defined the terrifying, fragile rhythm of your existence, until the day the heavy earth finally claimed the broken body he owned, and you simply became another entry in the village burial record. You might have escaped the hangman's noose. You might have survived the Lord's unjust taxes, but there was one enemy you could never flee, the invisible, suffocating killer that permeated the very air you breathed, the microbial army that made the heavy earth claim you decades before your time. It clung to the mud walls of your hovel, stewed in the stagnant water of the village well, and waited patiently in the uncleaned straw of your shared bedding, an omnipresent threat far more relentless than any invading army or cruel bailiff. This was the era of perpetual, low-grade biological warfare, where simple illness was not an inconvenience, but a terrifying death sentence delivered by the sheer lack of sanitation. A world where the stench of decay was the background music to your short, brutal life. In the rare, booming town, life was a symphony of sickening decay and explosive filth. Imagine stepping out onto a street that wasn't paved with cobblestones, but a treacherous, shifting slurry of human effluent, animal offal, and rotting vegetable matter, all churned together by the hooves of oxen and the boots of desperate men.
This wasn't just dirt. This was the breeding ground of biological annihilation, where every breath was a gamble, and every superficial cut risked deep vein infection, culminating in agonizing fever and the ultimate relinquishing of your soul. The common practice was casting out, and it meant tossing the contents of your chamber pot, the heavy, sloshing reality of intestinal failure, straight out the nearest window, often without a warning cry, praying it landed on a rival, or, better yet, the tax collector below.
Even the magnificent castles, those stone monuments to feudal power, were often little more than glorified septic tanks, the waste from the garderobes plummeting directly into the moat, turning the defensive barrier into a festering pool of lethal bacteria and pestilence. The great open sewers, running alongside what passed for major thoroughfares in London or York, were less sanitation infrastructure and more slow-moving rivers of plague, depositing their vile cargo into the nearest freshwater source with lethal efficiency. The lords and scholars whispered about miasmas, bad air rising from the swamps and the decaying material, believing that the illness was carried on the foul odors. But the terrifying truth was far simpler and far more immediate. The water was poison. To drink a clean, cool draught from the village river or well was to invite the bloody flux, a screaming, dehydrating descent into agonizing death that spared neither infant nor seasoned warrior. This is precisely why the common man, and even the child, relied utterly on weak, small ale or cider. It wasn't purely for pleasure or inebriation. It was a fundamental, desperate matter of survival. The brewing process, involving the crucial step of boiling the water, was the only reliable form of purification known to this brutal age, turning liquid death into a meager, if slightly intoxicating, source of daily hydration. Your existence was a chronic state of pain, a constant battle against biological invaders. If it wasn't the bone-deep ache from 12 hours behind the plow or the lingering effects of malnutrition, it was the incessant, terrifying throbbing in your mouth. Dental care was non-existent. A severe toothache meant either waiting for the inevitable fever and blood poisoning to take you, or seeking the terrifying local expert who wielded rusty, unsterilized pincers. Intestinal parasites, the unseen, hungry tenants, living off your already meager rations, were an inescapable, universal reality. You were perpetually sharing your scarce nutrients with monstrous worms, leading to crushing fatigue and a wasting sickness that slowly drained your life force, sometimes emerging horrifically and unexpectedly while you slept or labored. And when the sickness finally escalated, turning simple flux into fiery delirium or a debilitating skin infection, who did you turn to? The medieval doctor, the leech, or the dreaded barber surgeon? These were not men of gentle science, guided by empirical knowledge. They were tradesmen of pain, wielding tools that would make a modern executioner blanch in horror. Their entire system of healing was based on the ancient, flawed theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They were convinced that all illness stemmed from an imbalance, and to restore harmony, they had to drain the excess, an idea that led to more fatalities than any other concept of the era. Bloodletting was the terrifying, almost ritualistic default treatment for nearly everything, from a headache to a broken leg, from coughs to fever. Imagine lying there, already weak with fever and starving, watching a man slice open your arm or leg, allowing your precious, finite life force to spill into a bowl, believing that the cure was in the bleeding and the weakening. If you suffered a shattered limb from a farming accident or a bandit's blow, the solution was swift, brutal, and unimaginable: immediate amputation. There was no painkiller, save perhaps a massive dose of cheap, harsh wine, or a heavy blow to the head intended to stun you into temporary unconsciousness before the sawing began. The procedure was performed with unsterilized saws and knives, often right on the kitchen table or the dirt floor of the cottage, followed by the nightmare of cauterization, burning the stump with a searing hot iron or boiling pitch to stop the relentless bleed, filling the hut with the unbearable smell of scorched flesh and pure, primal terror. Survival rates were utterly negligible, and infection was not the complication, it was the absolute expectation. The barber surgeon's fee often simply purchased the quickest possible trip to the grave, ensuring your lord would soon be looking for a new, compliant pair of hands to work his fields. Every moment of your life was a desperate tightrope walk over an abyss of sickness and injury. The fragility of your life wasn't just determined by the Lord's mood or the harsh weather of the harvest. It was woven into the very fabric of your existence, hidden in the water, carried on the wind, and waiting in the hands of the man who promised to heal you, but usually sealed your doom. This constant, low-grade biological warfare, fought with no weapons but hope and weak ale, was the true, unsung horror of medieval England, ensuring that the heavy earth always had a fresh victim waiting, ready to become another forgotten entry in the burial ledger before the next planting season even began. They survived the plague. They outran the famine. But there was one enemy they could never evade, one specter that haunted the dawn more reliably than the Black Death itself: the Lord of the Manor. His authority was not negotiated, it was simply inhaled, a suffocating atmosphere of absolute power that stretched across every single clod of dirt the peasant worked. Every breath the serf took, every kernel of grain he hoped to store, was first measured against the demands of the man who lived behind the stone walls, the man whose bloodline somehow mandated ownership over human existence itself. The system of feudalism wasn't just a tax bracket, it was a cage forged of ancient custom and backed by cold, unforgiving steel. The serf might have held the sickle, but the lord held the entire field, and this distinction was the difference between a meager survival and an immediate, agonizing death. The lord's power was codified through the brutal mechanism of labor dues and layered extraction, ensuring that poverty was not just a condition, but a legal obligation passed down through generations. You toiled for 3 days on your own miserable strip, hoping desperately to fill your empty belly and clothe your shivering family. But the next 3 days, the crucial, back-breaking days right in the middle of harvest season, were legally surrendered entirely to the Lord's domain. This forced labor, the corvée, ensured that the Lord's granaries were always bursting at the seams, while the serfs were perpetually staring into the abyss of next year's starvation, balanced on a razor's edge. This unpaid labor was the engine of the entire noble economy, built upon the aching backs and frayed nerves of the common folk, who saw their best efforts stolen before their eyes. If you faltered, if you dared to show weakness or protest the inhuman hours, the Lord's bailiff was there, a man whose only loyalty was to the stone walls and the heavy purse they protected. Then came the layered extraction, a financial scaffolding of despair, designed not just to take a portion, but to take everything that offered comfort or security. First, the rent, often paid in sheaves of grain or livestock, a literal heavy chunk of your fragile survival handed over twice yearly, leaving you instantly poorer than you were before the harvest began. Second, the compulsory church tithe, 10% of everything, a massive offering made in abject fear of eternal damnation, adding yet another heavy sack to the shrinking pile of provisions meant to last until the next autumn. God and the king, it seemed, were always hungry, and they always ate first. But the worst, the ultimate gut punch to the already reeling peasant, was the tallage. This was an arbitrary, unpredictable tax imposed entirely at the whim of the Lord, sometimes demanded just because he needed new armor or wished to fund a minor skirmish miles away, or simply felt the need to remind his subjects of his limitless power. It was a tax on simply breathing, a sudden devastating withdrawal from your non-existent savings, guaranteeing that even a good harvest year could be instantly transformed into a crushing economic disaster, based solely on the Lord's fluctuating mood. It was a clear, chilling reminder that your entire existence was merely an income stream for the nobility, and you had no right to question the flow.
If the direct taxes weren't enough to bleed you dry, the banalités certainly were. These were the monopoly rights the Lord held over all essential infrastructure, ensuring that even tasks necessary for basic survival required a mandatory payment to the manor. You couldn't just grind your own hard-won wheat with 2 stones. You were legally compelled to use the Lord's mill, a mill that often took a substantial toll, grinding not just the grain, but grinding away at your meager profit margin, often taking 1 bushel for every 10 ground. Want to bake the essential bread? The communal oven belonged exclusively to the Lord, and you paid him again, usually with a portion of the finished loaf itself, a staggering tax on the final product you created with your own hands and ingredients. The sheer, outrageous audacity of the system. You grew the grain, you harvested it, you carried it miles, and yet you had to pay 2 separate fees just to turn it into something edible. This was control down to the microscopic level, where the Lord wasn't just taxing your land, he was taxing your time, your effort, and the very act of basic sustenance. He held the keys to life and death simply by controlling the means of production, forcing the terrified population into inescapable economic bondage from the cradle to the grave. And what recourse did the starving serf have when disputes arose, or when the Lord's bailiff stretched the definition of the corvée until their bones screamed in exhaustion? None. Absolutely none. The Lord was the final arbiter, the supreme judge in the manorial court, a terrifying theater of localized control, where justice was never blind, but always heavily biased toward the man sitting on the velvet cushion. Fines were the common punishment, not jail time, which wasted potential labor, but crippling financial penalties designed specifically to siphon away any remaining scraps of wealth the peasant might have desperately hidden. If a pig escaped and rooted up the Lord's precious garden, the fine was immediate and often catastrophic, requiring the sale of a tool or a vital piece of livestock just to satisfy the debt. If a young man, driven mad by the crushing weight of servitude, tried to flee the estate, hoping to find freedom in a burgeoning town, the penalty, if caught, was brutally swift and public. He faced a public shaming, followed by an even heavier yoke of debt and obligation, ensuring no one else dared to breach the sacred, terrifying contract of servitude. The walls of the manor house didn't just contain the Lord. They contained the entire claustrophobic and utterly inescapable world of the peasant. This was the daily, agonizing calculus of medieval existence, measuring the caloric output of your labor against the relentless, extractive demands of the noble class. There was no room for error, no cushion for disaster, and absolutely no hope for upward mobility. Your grandfather died a serf, your father died a serf, and unless a miraculous plague or a great peasant revolt broke the chain,
both equally terrifying and bloody prospects, you too would surrender your entire existence to the same crushing cycle. The horror of medieval England wasn't just the sudden violence or the visible suffering of famine. It was the slow, deliberate economic strangulation, the soul-crushing knowledge that every drop of sweat, every moment of relief, was legally owned by someone else. The ground beneath their feet was constantly shifting, held fast only by the cruel, unyielding hand of the feudal master, ensuring that life was a perpetual, debt-ridden sentence. The serf knew the price of his life wasn't measured in silver, but in calories. Every sunrise demanded a miracle just to fuel the punishing labor. But the reality was a slow, agonizing starvation that masqueraded as daily sustenance. Their diet was a monotonous, grim liturgy of survival, centered around the single terrifying word: pottage.
This wasn't a hearty stew. It was a thin, watery gruel, a desperate concoction of whatever meager grains, oats, barley, rye, could be scraped together, boiled with wild herbs, and maybe, if they were blessed by the devil himself, a scrap of dried pea or bean. Meat? That was a myth whispered around winter fires, reserved for the Lord's table, an almost sacred, untouchable commodity that hung just outside the serf's reach, eternally taunting them.
To eat flesh was to invite immediate, brutal punishment, an accusation of poaching the Lord's sacred bounty, the consequences of which were swift and horrifying. This crippling lack of protein meant the serf rarely had the strength for the labor demanded of him, creating a cruel, self-fulfilling prophecy of weakness and debt. They were perpetually running on empty, their body systems breaking down before they reached the age of 35.
Their only hope for variation was foraging, a risky game played on the fringes of the Lord's estate, scavenging for wild berries, mushrooms, or edible roots, constantly fearing the guard's shadow. Even the water they drank, drawn from shared village streams or shallow wells, was a silent poisoner, contaminated by animal waste and human filth, guaranteeing the constant churn of gut-wrenching illness that plagued every household.
The entire fragile scaffolding of their existence rested upon the single, terrifying roll of the dice, known as the annual harvest. This was not just farming. This was a high-stakes gamble against God, weather, and the rats. One bad summer storm, one prolonged drought, one infestation of blight, and the whole village, hundreds of souls, would face the immediate, unspeakable certainty of famine. They weren't just hungry, they were staring into the abyss of non-existence, knowing that if they didn't pay their rent in grain, the Lord would take their very last seed corn, condemning the family not just for the current winter, but for the entire cycle of the following year. This forced decision, starve now or guarantee starvation later, was the terrifying mathematical reality of medieval survival, a calculation that drove sane men to madness.
and the tools they used to coax life from the unforgiving earth, they were relics of suffering. Forget the gleaming, efficient steel of modern agriculture. The serf wielded implements so crude, so heavy, they seemed designed less for cultivation and more for penance. Tools passed down through generations, each furrow etched by desperation.
The plowshare was often just iron-tipped wood, dragging through the dense clay soil, requiring not one man, but often a team of oxen, or 8 weary souls straining against the harness, inch by agonizing inch, under the relentless, unforgiving sun. Every back-breaking pull, every calloused hand, was a direct payment to the feudal master. When the punishing daylight finally faded, the serf retreated not to a sanctuary, but to a hovel, a terrifyingly temporary structure of wattle and daub, thatch and mud. These homes were designed primarily to keep the rain out, a battle they often lost, leaving the air thick with the stench of damp earth, smoke, and unwashed bodies, perfect incubators for lung rot and fever.
There was no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters slammed shut against the biting cold and the unseen dangers lurking in the pitch-black night. The livestock, often including the pig and the chickens, were frequently brought inside during the harshest weather, sharing the cramped, disease-ridden space with the family, blurring the line between human shelter and animal pen. The central hearth, the very heart of the home, was also its greatest threat. A perpetually smoldering peat or wood fire, the smoke had no chimney, only a hole in the roof, meaning that for half the year, the family lived shrouded in a choking, acrid haze. This constant exposure ravaged their lungs, a slow, insidious killer that weakened them year after year, guaranteeing that a simple winter cough could transform into the fatal consumption, leaving their children gasping for air in the smoky darkness. Beyond the tiny, struggling fields lay the forest, the wild heart of England, and another source of profound dread. This wasn't a place for pleasant walks. It was a kingdom of shadows, ruled by the king's law, yes, but also by genuine predators. Wolves still roamed, not just starving strays, but organized packs, drawn by the smell of livestock and the vulnerability of isolated dwellings. Every animal sound in the night was a confirmation of imminent danger, a reminder that the thin walls of the hovel were no defense against the teeth and claws of the ancient world. But the wolf wasn't the greatest danger in the woods. The greatest danger was the Lord's forester, the ultimate enforcer of property rights. To step into the Lord's woods, even in desperate search of firewood or a rabbit to save your child from starvation, was the ultimate capital offense, a transgression met not with a fine, but often with the severing of a hand or swift execution. The king's deer were more valuable than the serf's life, and that was a cold, iron fact, universally understood. This was the ultimate trespass, an act of rebellion against the entire feudal structure. Survival was therefore an act of calculated, terrifying risk.
every day a negotiation between crippling labor, chronic hunger, and the iron laws of the powerful. They lived pressed against the bare earth, their entire world contained within the sightlines of the Lord's manor, their existence a testament to human endurance, yet perpetually teetering on the edge of utter collapse. The sheer, overwhelming physicality of medieval life meant that even when the plague wasn't scouring the land, the serf was always, relentlessly, fighting for his next breath, a prisoner of hunger and the mud.